Not too bad. Hola. So Luminostic, thank you guys so much for joining me. Tonight we're going to talk about ayahuasca, which is an absolutely amazing, legendary, super psychedelic from the Amazon rainforest that's been in use for thousands of years. And it actually lives up to and maybe even exceeds its reputation. Hello, John. And thankfully, science is corroborating that on a lot of levels. Clinical therapy studies, as well as neurophysiology and neurochemistry studies. Hello, Kyle. Are confirming what any of us that have encountered this medicine already know, that it causes tremendous and meaningful changes in the beings of those that consume it. Oftentimes, only 1 to 3 sessions are all that's needed to address lifelong problems, addiction, PTSD, depression, trauma. And because of the way the compounds that are present in the brew affect the brain, changing its neuroplasticity, increasing neurogenesis, the changes that are affected last. This is also notably the case with just about every other entheogen, at least the major ones that have been studied. LSD in particular has been shown to be the most efficacious at catalyzing neurogenesis and enhancing the brain's neuroplasticity. And they are curing addictions and all sorts of psychological aberrations, oftentimes with a single dose, which is, of course, a massive threat to the pharmaceutical industry, who, they're selling so many benzodiazepine tranquilizers that the ocean is testing positive for Xanax. Right, just to give you an idea, SSRIs are huge as well. As we're all noticing, I think the United States culture is extremely toxic. And the consequence of that is that people are having a lot of issues. Compounds that can correct any of those with a single dose, that, in my opinion, is why the studies on psychedelics were shut down in the 60s. And this is another thing to take note of. It's not that the governments, the lawmakers, the propagandists were actually misinformed. The same is true of marijuana. When the government commissioned studies, the researchers all said pretty harmless, not really addictive. Somehow the government chose to hear something else. And so these drug laws are actually designed to protect the pharmaceutical industry, amongst other things. It's also a way to suppress the evolution of consciousness, because enlightened people don't need to be governed, and they know it. They know they are each other's reflection, right? You especially if you've had like a 5-MeO DMT experience, or you've meditated your way all the way to samadhi or satori, and you've experienced firsthand the universal consciousness, you know that eventually you will experience the entire universe in its totality. And so this gives you a different perception of your responsibility to the experience of other sentient beings. Because whatever they suffer, eventually you're going to literally be them. So, getting a little bit off track, but I think all that is very valid. I'm not going to go too deep into the chemistry of it because I've made videos about that already, and I would assume that most of you probably have some idea. But it bears mentioning because it is the existence of ayahuasca is basically miraculous. There are a tremendous number of plant species in the Amazon rainforest. I've been told that like a hectare of rainforest on average has more biodiversity than the state of Oklahoma. So the chances that 72 tribes, many of whom did not communicate, they would spear each other on sight. They weren't sitting around a fire teaching each other what they'd figured out about Banisteriopsis copy and Psychotria viridis or Chalipanga that we use here in Ecuador. So it is true that these plants are relatively common. In Zamora, near where I live, Chalipanga is one of the most common plants in the forest. It's everywhere. And ayahuasca is not exactly uncommon. So the chances that these two plants would happenstance be combined somehow over the course of thousands of years, even in so many far-flung tribes, it's not impossible, but it is highly improbable. And of course, if you ask the indigenous, a very common answer would be something along the lines of, the jungle told us, like usually with some shock, like, what, you don't talk to the jungle, gringo, you know? And speaking of science, by the way, in my opinion, everything that happens on this plane has to have some sort of mechanistic conduit, right? So things like telepathy, precognition, and receiving information directly from a plant intelligence is going to have some kind of mechanistic way that it happens. And so the discovery of the biophoton is one of the theories that's being touted as a sort of scientific basis for how it is that people can receive information from plants. And so every square centimeter of living tissue, anything that contains DNA, emits these biophotons at the rate of 100 per square centimeter per second, I think it is. So a lot of them. And it is thought that they contain information. And so DNA is constantly showering itself with information from all of the other forms of DNA around it. And so when the indigenous shaman says, we talk to the jungle, we may have found the material basis that facilitates that. And so neither of these plants, whether used chacruna or chalipanga, because DMT, which is the constituent in those plants, is rendered inactive by metabolic salt in the stomach. Well, it just so happens that the harmara alkaloids in the copy vine are not only catalyzed by the DMT, but they are MAO inhibitors, which neutralize the salt that would destroy the DMT. And so there's a very complex chemical process that happens. And also the ratios have to be right. It's a process. So the possibility that this is like strong evidence that people actually learn something directly from a plant definitely, is present in the story of ayahuasca, which I've always really appreciated. So, that's enough of the chemistry aspect. As far as therapy goes, people ask me quite often, which compounds are best for what purposes? And ayahuasca, I think overall, is kind of king or queen, as it were, possibly. It definitely deals with traumas that a lot of other therapies and other entheogenic compounds can't quite reach. Tobacco, actually, which is very controversial because people think of it as just a poison, and I've heard it called a neurotoxin. But in my experience, that is up there with ayahuasca in terms of particularly curing anger problems. I used to have quite the temper, and all it took was drinking tobacco 2 or 3 times and never again. So ayahuasca is definitely extremely effective with depression and PTSD and helping with addiction. But I think that there are other compounds that may be more appropriate for some of these other issues, depending on the individual. And the reason I say that is that something like MDMA doesn't have this worldview threatening, for a person coming from a very matrix-oriented type of consciousness, the deconstruction that happens from being confronted by this other dimension can be too much for somebody that is like really, really severely traumatized. For individuals like that, I would strongly suggest trying to arrange with a shaman or therapist to have a solo ceremony. But I think it would be much wiser probably to just have some MDMA therapy before you move on to ayahuasca. And there are a lot of people in the plant medicine community that kind of frown on synthetic or semi-synthetic entheogens. And I don't think that really makes sense. I think that, particularly in the case of LSD and MDMA, we have compounds that are more efficacious than anything else. They have very low toxicity. They're extremely safe, more or less totally non-addictive. So I think that they are also definitely not more efficacious and less subject to abuse by an industry. And by abuse, I mean abuse of people for profit. So the emotional level for ayahuasca is definitely where it reigns supreme. On a neurophysiological basis, it has been studied cells both in vitro and in humans. It does increase the length of the arbors, which allows for the formation of more dendrites and facilitates higher cognition. So another element of just self-improvement, if you're not traumatized, if you're not addicted to something, you are facilitating your evolution and creating physically in your body a more sophisticated brain capable of better memory, faster processing, enhancing learning. It's truly extraordinary. Also, they have noticed that long-term ayahuasca users, the shape of the prefrontal cortex actually changes significantly. So a lot of interesting stuff to study in the area of neurobiology and the neurochemistry and all of the changes that happen with these substances. So I talked about fact and fiction, myth versus truth. Ayahuasca has become an industry. And because I've been studying it for so long, as it has become a pop culture phenomenon, I've noticed that there are suddenly things that are traditional protocol that never existed more than 10 years ago anywhere in the anthropological record I've ever seen. And there are reasons for that. And I'm definitely going to do my best to explain how I think that happened. And I'm not trying to put down anybody's, teachings or any particular tradition. I am just discussing this stuff in the interest of clarity, so that we really understand what is traditional and what is actually just a product of the industry. And one of the things that's happened is that ayahuasca has developed a reputation for healing things that it may not actually heal. I was very surprised myself because it seemed that there was so much of a consensus in regards to parasites. A lot of people claim that ayahuasca kills parasites. And I did have an extraordinary experience with that, where she just kept flushing and flushing. I was trying to vomit and I was drinking all this gallons and gallons of water. And instead of vomiting, it would just go straight through over and over and over again. Like I could not. And a few weeks earlier in the jungle, she had told me that I had contracted parasites in California when I was lost in the mountains for 3 days and 4 nights and drinking out of streams. And she said, I can flush the bugs, but I cannot kill the eggs. And so will it help if you have a parasite infestation? I would imagine absolutely it's going to make it a lot easier to kill them, because you're going to flush all of that stuff out. A lot of the eggs probably too, but you're going to need to follow it up with either tobacco, which, you guys got to make sure that you do that with somebody that knows what they're doing. It can be dangerous. It usually isn't. but it definitely can be dangerous, but it definitely kills parasites. I'd like to hear about that time lost in California. Okay, we can take a quick digression, I guess. I had gone up to pick black trumpet mushrooms, and I had found the biggest patch that I had ever seen. And so I wasn't really paying attention, and I worked my way around to the other side of the bushes, but it looked exactly the same as the other side of the mountain. So I went down the wrong side of the mountain, and I could not get back up before dark, and I thought maybe I could go around. So at any rate, maybe I'll make a video about that story sometime, because I did get the mountain lion was tracking me. Its prints were in my boots when I would go back. There were mountain lion prints in my shoe prints in the mud. So that was a crazy. I don't want to get too far off subject here, mostly because I'll forget what I was talking about. Okay, and so cancer. That's another big one that I've heard a lot of stories from shamans that I trust. Recently, I was told about a woman who had a massive tumor in her tongue, and she had tried all these other treatments, and she drank ayahuasca for like 21 days, I think, almost straight. And it did, she did eventually get rid of the tumor. And I've heard other stories, but it definitely doesn't work consistently. I think everyone is different. All cancers are probably different. So I don't know that reputation has really been substantiated. Although, we're kind of in the early stages of really going in depth with studies all over the world. And I'm sure that we're going to find, there are really a lot more compounds than just the harmalas and DMT. DMT, I also know, can cure chronic fatigue syndrome, and nothing does. But you just take 3 hits and your symptoms are gone for months, for sure. So those two are really the only ones that I can think of that really have a reputation that is not really substantiated. Another thing I wanted to talk about is the dieta, because for the Shipibo, for example, who have one of the most sophisticated relationships with the plants, it was definitely traditional to, if you're basically what you're doing with the chemicals in the plants, in Western terms, is you are attenuating the frequency of your consciousness by changing chemical keys. I hope that's a good way to communicate that. But, in Western terms, that's the idea of these prolonged plant medicine diets. It depends on what your goals are, what you're trying to discover, what you're trying to heal, what you're preparing yourself to heal with someone else. There are all these different regimented, lengthy, often very, very difficult dietas that the Shipibo and some of the other tribes will prescribe for people. But the other dieta is this list of prohibited activities and foods with varying lengths of time preceding your ayahuasca experience. And I'm in no way saying that anyone should not adhere to that stuff to some extent. But I can tell you with 100% certainty, with tons of observation and personal experimentation, much of it just isn't true. And many of the tribes here in Ecuador didn't have anything like a dieta. I'm not going to single anybody out, because people will actually get suspicious when they don't, when a shaman doesn't give them the industry protocol. They're like, well, that's not what I read everywhere, or what the other shamans said, or and that's really unfortunate, because a lot of them are just as legit as anyone else, and they just don't have that. And it doesn't change the experience, lessen it. One of the tribes here, when they come down from medicine, when they leave the space, if they're hungry, they'll eat monkeys. Another tribe was supposedly taught to shrink heads and sew the eyes and mouth and nose holes shut. And they would do this after drinking ayahuasca. So, that's another element of this, that people have this idea that ayahuasca is just going to transform someone into like a gentle vegan hippie or something. And that may be true if that facilitates the health and well-being of that individual, which what seems to be the agenda of this plant spirit or this consciousness, whatever it is that is behind the ayahuasca experience. It does seem to have an interest in health and life and vitality. To me, it's like Mother Nature, just wanting to empower all of the organisms. And the explanation I can give you for why, and people ask this a lot, like, okay, so if ayahuasca enlightens and it transforms people spiritually, why were so many of the South American tribes spearing each other constantly and shrinking each other's heads and all of this kind of stuff? It didn't stop that. And the answer is that would not have facilitated their survival, because there are going to be other tribes that are going to do spearing raids, whether they like it or not. And if they don't occasionally do spearing raids on one of the neighboring tribes, they're going to get too big, and then they're going to come and eventually extinct the other tribe. So the reason that this Pachamama spirit didn't have that effect on those people is because it didn't serve their purposes. At least that's my suspicion about that. And again, adhering to the dieta, I think, is important. Even if some of the things that are prohibited don't really need to be prohibited, it ensures that you are committing to having a meaningful experience. You're disciplining yourself before you're entering into this space. You're increasing your focus, because being exposed to an interdimensionality like the ayahuasca space is it can be very overwhelming and disorienting. So anything that you can do prior to the experience to focus your mind, to cleanse the body. But it is absolutely not true that it's traditional not to eat meat or not to have sex or a number of red meat. I know plenty of people that just eat whatever. And it's definitely not advised in the beginning, because some people die when they drink ayahuasca, and it's really not clear why. It's thought that people with a pre-existing heart condition that they just weren't aware of. In my opinion, sometimes it just takes people, and that may not be accurate, but that's my intuition about that. Because some of them are really difficult to explain. I know of a situation where a lady had drank medicine tons of times before. Everyone else was fine. She laid down to start the medicine and just died. So what I'm getting at there is that just in case there's something about your specific physiology that would create some sort of chemical conflict or some energetic interference, it's I'm not discouraging anyone from adhering to the dieta. I'm just saying that what happened is that tourists, the more they were drinking ayahuasca, some of them would die, and nobody knew why. So they started prohibiting things to try to limit it. People still died, so they just added more and more stuff to the list, So I think that's the truth about that. The sex thing, I think that there is a reason for that, although I do know people that incorporate sex into their practice, with partners and stuff, not like at a ceremony with the public or whatever, but, in their private practice, and they definitely don't suffer from it. But I think that you have to make sure that you have dealt with yourself, that your traumas are reasonably ameliorated, that you have a genuine connection and understanding with this person, and that you don't mind merging your energetic being with theirs to that degree. Because I guess one of the ways that we can think about the way that these type of compounds work is that they bring down filters in the nervous system that screen stuff out. And I think that I know that we are much more susceptible to the resonance or the consciousness of another being when we're in these states. But it can be a very good thing. I mean, I was once taught by ayahuasca about sound, how to sing with two pitches, so that one is a little bit out of tune or out of phase with the other, and it creates this kind of tension. And the purpose of this is that the other energy in the room, as you resolve, you bring them together. When you resolve it, it pulls the energy in the room, and it creates a resolution, so that there's this harmonic homeostasis that is created in the space that you're in. And of course, since then, I've read a lot about brain wave oscillations and entrainment, and that actually, they're working on developing a type of therapy using exactly the ancient ayahuasca technology that I just described. But what I was saying with that is that pulses always entrain to the higher frequency. So this can be a way for one person to lift another up. So I think that the prohibition on sex, it just needs to be more of an individual decision, because I know for certain that no harm comes of it. Another thing that you have to be careful with is serotonin. Anything that really boosts serotonin, like an orgasm, can potentially be dangerous when you have an NAI in your system. So that is a consideration. Also, something I've observed that it doesn't really bother me. I mean, it's fine, but there has this new style of medicine music has developed. And people often refer to this stuff as Icaros. And really, they're just sort of like Spanish romance folk songs that have absolutely nothing to do with what a real Icaro would have sounded like 1,000 years ago in the jungle. And I think it's really unfortunate that that is sort of, I've seen situations where people felt like the shaman had shortchanged them because they didn't sing in that style at all. I don't. And when you hear the real ancient Icaros, which is of course not what the tribes would call them, but when you hear a Kofan sing in his native tongue, or there's also this channeling of the language of these interdimensional beings, which is one interpretation of what it is. The shuar, for example, say that they are the sounds that the spirits made when they created the universe, which is interesting because that's basically the same creation mythos as the Jews have. That the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet were the word that rushed forth and vibrated the universe into existence. But that type of music is not traditional ayahuasca music, and when these songs are sung by shamans that genuinely know how to channel, or they're singing in shuar or kofan, the effect is unbelievably powerful. It has to be witnessed to be understood. And consistently, what will happen is that, say, someone is carrying something really heavy, there's a tremendous amount of dissonance in their being. And so suddenly the shaman sings in these really intense channeled tongues, and as it gets more and more and more powerful, suddenly the person will scream and the shaman will run forward and blow the flower water all over the person and dispel the energy, and they'll vomit and vomit and vomit and vomit, and then they're fine like nothing happened. And it is an incredible thing to witness. Another thing that I've noticed about these shamans that are really in touch with that is that, on those rare occasions when I have felt like I was having trouble, gets wild out there, without fail, the shaman would be, like above me. There was like a deck and then like another deck above it. He'd be right above me singing, and, before I even really got into trouble. And it just occurred to me now that maybe that's what provoked it, that maybe he was exercising something from me, and it wasn't so much that he anticipated that I was about to get in trouble. He was pushing something through. And of course, people really want to have what they consider an authentic experience, and that's getting more and more difficult. An illustration that I can offer in regards to that is that one of the local tribes will, only if you ask, they will tell you the industry standard that they know you expect them to tell you, but it's not actually their tradition. And I think that that's a really unfortunate consequence of really the influence of the internet and pop culture, because real tradition and authentic experiences are getting sort of occulted by this sort of like mainstream perception of what things should be. And a lot of the tribes are actually adapting to what is primarily Shipibo, but they are giving the tourists the experience they know they expect, rather than actually showing them their own customs. And I've seen this with my own eyes. And you also have to be careful as well. There are very sincere and honest shaman, but even a good shaman will have a white person on. Oftentimes, these guys, it's very common for them to have a sort of almost like Yoda-like personality, to be like impish and like a trickster. And so I've seen, for example, the indigenous will, somebody will pay them $20 to teach them to build a fire, and they'll just make them try all day in the wet jungle, which is practically impossible. And if he tries to pull a roll of toilet paper out, they say, "Oh, it's forbidden to use toilet paper." And then they go back to camp and they start their fire with toilet paper. So, just when you guys are hearing things, if you have these experiences, just remember that you might be getting put on, because that does happen a lot. So, it's my partner's birthday, so I think I'm going to wrap it up. I think we pretty much covered everything. I mean, I'm encouraging people to, if you really want to understand ayahuasca in its traditional context, it's good to look back in the older anthropological stuff, before Terence McKenna, like pre-Terence McKenna, before this stuff got, the contamination from pop culture. You're going to get a much clearer vision of what the protocols were, and what's authentic and what's not. And also, you can just use common sense. When people are talking about traditional Icaros and they start singing in Spanish, that doesn't really make sense. And I'm not criticizing it. I'm just saying that's obviously not traditional. God, I just thought of one more. But I also should mention that I am not saying that we should abandon tradition at all. From my point of view, we are in unprecedented a moment in human history in a lot of ways. Of course, there's a lot of chaos and craziness going on in the world. But in terms of our ability to take conscious charge of our own evolution, to heal our own traumas, to develop ourselves and enhance our neurophysiology, and also our access to like hermetic practices, the Western occult tradition. Oh, that is something I missed. Another thing that you will spot, and this is another reason I encourage studying these different traditions, is that you will see really surprising parallels. Okay, the way that the ayahuasca ceremony happens in a circle, and you try to maintain coherence in the circle, because the circle is your consciousness, and it also gives a perimeter for the shaman to hold space and take care of the energy. The Western magician does the same exact thing. He makes a circle. He takes control of the energy within it. In most cases, he's doing it alone, but there are group ceremonies. The very same thing happens. The singing, in order to harmonize the space, they call it vibrating, usually in the Western magic tradition. In the Western occult tradition, people are said to be turning to the left if they are an evil sorcerer or a bad shaman. and they're turning to the right if they're working for the collective good. The same is true in the jungles of Borneo. There are a number of these consistencies. So I think that if you're ever evaluating authenticity, if you know all of these traditions, you're going to be able to spot a lot. And so what I was saying is that this access and knowledge of these entheogenic compounds, combined with the fact that we now have access to yoga, to all these different forms of meditation, to the Western occult tradition, which, if you guys have a bad perception of that, trust me, it's not anything evil. It can be. They're all tools. You can do evil things with ayahuasca if you want to as well. It definitely happens. So integrating all of these systems and really taking responsibility for our ability to live in accordance with our highest self, we have greater opportunity to become like Nietzsche's supermensch than anyone ever has in history. And physics and studies in consciousness are confirming with absolute certainty that consciousness influences the behavior of subatomic particles, and that people that meditate are better at it. And I would be willing to bet if there were meditators that had also enhanced themselves with entheogenic compounds were thrown into the mix to be tested, that they would be better than anyone. And then I thought, okay, so if our influence as individuals is relatively minimal, what if we had 100 million people with a unified will directing their consciousness in order to cause tomorrow's probability wave to collapse into something greater than we ever could have imagined? And this is something that I'm seriously giving thought to and considering, like, how could I create an international community or find people that are already heading that direction and actually do something with this idea, because I'm 100% certain that it is absolutely a potent way for us to change. I mean, if you look at the machine that we're up against, consciousness, the plane of consciousness, the energetic plane, is the only avenue that could be a conduit to the kind of change we need to see. If it doesn't work, nothing is going to. Plain and simple. So I hope you guys enjoyed this live stream. I will be back in a few days. The Palladian space rock video is coming out soon. That's a hell of a story. So thank you guys so much for spending some time with me. Please smash the like button, share, subscribe. Supporting us on Patreon really helps keep the camera rolling and upgrades coming. So I will certainly pass that on, Osmatar. So aho and good night.